Imagine one lone American destroyer steaming straight into a storm of steel, outnumbered by a fleet that should have guaranteed its destruction. It sounds impossible, like a tale of myth or exaggerated legend. Yet, history recorded it with precision. Off the Philippine coast in October 1944, a handful of U.S. destroyers and destroyer escorts hurled themselves at one of the most powerful naval formations Imperial Japan ever assembled. At the center of this clash stood a single ship, USS Johnston, whose audacity rewrote what was thought possible at sea. This was no duel of equals. On paper, the Japanese center force dwarfed the American screen in every measurable way. Battleships bristling with 18-inch guns, heavy cruisers with broadside firepower to sink carriers in a single salvo, and swarms of destroyers advancing under the command of seasoned admirals. Facing them were small American carriers designed to support ground troops and their escort of destroyers, the lightest ships of the fleet, fast and agile, but never intended to face battleships head-on. And yet, in the hours that followed, these destroyers did exactly that. To understand how this came to be, one must first see the context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was late 1944. The Allies had returned to the Philippines, fulfilling General MacArthur's famous vow. Japan, desperate to halt the landings, launched Operation Shogo, a bold and complex naval counterstroke. Multiple Japanese task forces were dispatched, intending to converge and annihilate the American invasion fleet. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was the most formidable of them. After surviving attacks in the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita's ships slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24th, undetected by forces that should have blocked their passage. By dawn on the 25th, they loomed unexpectedly off the coast of Samar, bearing down on a tiny American escort carrier group known as Taffy 3. This was the setup for one of the most lopsided confrontations in naval history. On the American side, 6 jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their mission was to provide air cover for the invasion troops, not to slug it out with the main battle fleet of the Japanese Navy. They carried small numbers of aircraft with limited ordnance, meant for close support, not anti-ship strikes. Their destroyers were armed with 5-inch guns and a handful of torpedoes. Against them bore down battleships that had once terrorized the Pacific, including Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built. The disparity was almost beyond comprehension. Yet, at 06:48 that morning, radar screens and lookouts confirmed the sight of the enemy fleet. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, and the Americans were in a trap. There should have been no hope, but war often turns not on what should be, but on what individuals are willing to do in the moment. Among those individuals was Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of USS Johnston. A Cherokee from Oklahoma, Evans had already earned a reputation for boldness. At Johnston's commissioning, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go into harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." His words were about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The Japanese opened fire with their long-range guns at 6.59. Salvos from battleships straddled the escort carriers, towering plumes of water marking the beginning of a slaughter. The small carriers frantically launched aircraft, many without full fuel or armament, sending anything that could fly into the air. But their guns could not stop the oncoming fleet. The destroyers, positioned as a protective screen, had one choice: stand between the carriers and the Japanese advance. At 07:06, Evans gave the order that would define his ship forever. He swung USS Johnston hard over and accelerated to flank speed. Alone ahead of the screen, he charged straight toward the enemy battleships. It was a move so audacious that even Japanese officers later admitted they thought at first it must be some kind of feint or trick, but it was no feint. It was a knife against a sledgehammer, thrown with precision. Johnston's 5-inch guns barked, firing at Japanese heavy cruisers. Shells, too small to penetrate armor, still raked superstructures, splintered radar, and set fires. At 07:10, Evans ordered a torpedo attack. Charging through a maelstrom of shell fire, Johnston loosed 10 torpedoes at the lead Japanese column. Seconds later, explosions rocked the cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of the battle. One American destroyer had just taken a heavy cruiser out of the fight. Japanese battleships shifted fire onto Johnston, salvos of 14 and 18-inch shells hammering the sea around her. At Odo 724, she took her first major hit, losing power to part of her engines. Evans, undaunted, simply shifted control to the remaining systems and pressed on. Smoke poured from the wounded destroyer, but she did not stop firing. More torpedoes threatened other ships, forcing even mighty Yamato to turn away momentarily, disrupting Kurita's advance. Johnston wasn't finished. She weaved back toward the escort carriers, blasting at destroyers and cruisers that tried to push through. Again and again, Evans placed his thin-skinned ship between the enemy and his vulnerable charges. Shells ripped into her hull. One blast wrecked her bridge, killing or wounding many officers. Evans himself was injured, his clothes shredded, but he continued directing the fight from the stern. By now, the other American destroyers, Hoel and Herman, had joined the melee, launching their own torpedo attacks. Destroyer escorts like Samuel B. Roberts charged in as well. It became a desperate close-quarters brawl. Japanese commanders, shocked by the ferocity of the defense, began to hesitate. Smoke, rain squalls, and constant harassment from American aircraft, many dropping only machine gun fire or depth charges for lack of proper bombs, added to the confusion. Kurita believed he was facing a far stronger force than the reality. But it was Johnston, bleeding from dozens of wounds, that had set the tone of defiance. By Oro 9:45, the end was near. Johnston was dead in the water, pummeled by repeated heavy-caliber hits. Survivors recalled Evans standing exposed, still shouting orders, still fighting as long as any gun could bear. At 10:10, with the ship listing heavily and fires raging, he gave the final order to abandon ship. Moments later, USS Johnston rolled and slipped beneath the waves. Of her 327 crew, only 101 survived. Evans was among the missing, later awarded the Medal of Honor for his gallantry. Yet his sacrifice, and that of his men, were not in vain. The relentless attacks of Johnston and her fellow escorts had convinced Kurita that he was facing the main American carrier fleet. Fearing annihilation, he ordered withdrawal. The invasion at Leyte was saved. A single destroyer had taken on an entire fleet, and by sheer audacity, altered the course of battle. This was not a duel of equals, nor a case of firepower overcoming firepower. It was courage, initiative, and determination against overwhelming odds. Johnston's charge became legend, a symbol of the fighting spirit that refused to yield even in the face of certain destruction. And that morning off Samar, it proved enough to turn disaster into salvation. The storm over Samar had barely begun when Johnston and her captain had already set the tone of defiance. But the story of that morning cannot be told by Johnston alone. To understand the full scale of what happened, we must step back and look at how the entire American escort group Taffy 3 fought with a determination that no calculation of firepower could ever explain. By 07:30 on October 25th, the battle had devolved into chaos. The Japanese center force, with its heavy cruisers and battleships in line ahead, had expected to find defenseless transports or perhaps a token screen. Instead, they found themselves under sudden torpedo attack from destroyers and destroyer escorts, and harassed from above by swarms of aircraft that seemed to arrive in endless waves. The reality was very different. The planes from Taffy 3's jeep carriers were lightly armed, many carrying only half-loads of bombs or nothing more than machine gun ammunition and depth charges. Pilots took off, knowing they had little to no chance of sinking battleships outright. Yet they attacked anyway, diving at the cruisers and battleships, strafing their decks, dropping whatever ordnance they had left, forcing evasive maneuvers and disrupting Japanese gunnery. This was the first key point: confusion. Japanese doctrine prized coordinated, concentrated firepower. But off Samar, everything became fragmented. Radar interference, smoke screens laid by the destroyers, rain squalls sweeping across the sea, and the frantic maneuvers of the American ships broke down Japanese cohesion. Instead of an organized push, their ships began firing independently, sometimes even interfering with each other's firing solutions. And into that confusion, the American destroyers charged again and again. USS Hull, under Commander Leon Kintberger, made her own torpedo run. Charging through curtains of shellfire, Hull launched spreads of torpedoes at the heavy cruisers Haguro and Chokai. She was hit repeatedly, pummeled until she could barely steer, but she did not retreat. By 0830, Hull had taken over 40 major caliber hits and dozens of smaller ones, yet still engaged until she sank with most of her crew. Heermann, the last of the three destroyers, also launched torpedoes that forced battleships to scatter. At one point, Heermann was the only American destroyer still capable of maneuvering at speed. She faced 4 battleships, including Yamato herself, plus a line of cruisers. Her commander, Amos Hathaway, zigzagged so close to the giants that their guns could not depress far enough to hit her. One Japanese officer watching the scene would later describe it as a lone wolf snapping at lions. The destroyer escorts, smaller and less heavily armed, should have been little more than prey. But Samuel B. Roberts, under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, earned her place in history that morning. Armed with just 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes, she charged at a heavy cruiser 3 times her size. Copeland's order to his crew was simple. "We're going in. We're making a torpedo run. Stand by." Roberts's torpedoes missed, but her gunnery was astonishing. She scored dozens of hits on the cruiser Chokai, damaging her superstructure and starting fires. For 35 minutes, Samuel B. Roberts fought until she was riddled with shellfire, listing and finally sinking. Survivors remembered Copeland standing calmly on deck, telling them he was proud of every one of them. These ships were not supposed to be there. They were not designed to duel with battleships. But at Samar, they did more than fight. They attacked so ferociously that the Japanese commanders became convinced they had stumbled into something far greater than an escort group. Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato, saw torpedoes rushing at his ships, plumes of water from constant airstrikes, destroyers charging without hesitation. To him, it looked like he had run into the main American fleet. What he could not know was that many of those American aircraft were making dry runs, attacking without weapons, simply to keep the pressure constant. Pilots of Taffy 3 returned to their carriers, refueled, rearmed with whatever could be loaded fastest. Sometimes depth charges meant for submarines, sometimes tiny 100-pound bombs, and immediately returned to harass again. Lieutenant Thomas C. McCarthy, flying a TBM Avenger, later recalled diving on a battleship with nothing but his machine guns. "I figured if I couldn't hurt her, maybe I could at least make them duck." Multiply that by dozens of aircraft, and the effect became overwhelming. The escort carriers themselves, slow and vulnerable, were firing everything they had. Anti-aircraft gunners aimed their small guns not at planes, but at battleships, desperate to add anything to the volume of fire. White smoke from their stacks marked their frantic attempts to gain speed, their tiny 19 knots pitiful against ships twice as fast. But their commanders kept them moving, kept them alive just long enough for the destroyers and planes to work. By mid-morning, Japanese confusion deepened. Kurita's ships had taken real damage. Several heavy cruisers were burning. One had lost her bow, another was dead in the water. Yamato herself had been forced to turn away temporarily, her main guns never fully brought to bear. And the torpedo attacks never seemed to end. At Aero 910, Kurita made the decision that stunned his officers. Believing he faced a full American fleet and worried about being drawn into a trap, he ordered withdrawal. The battleships turned back toward San Bernardino Strait. The Americans could hardly believe it. Against overwhelming odds, with little more than courage, smoke, and sheer aggression, Taffy 3 had turned away the most powerful fleet Japan could muster. But the victory came at terrible cost. Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were gone. Hundreds of sailors were dead, hundreds more adrift in the sea awaiting rescue. The carriers had been battered, several aircraft lost, and survivors would spend days in the water. Yet the invasion fleet at Leyte remained untouched, the landings secure, and the course of the Pacific War unchanged in Japan's favor. For the men of Taffy 3, the battle became a defining moment of valor. Historians would later call it the most heroic action in the history of the U.S. Navy. For Japan, Samar was a turning point of despair. Their last great chance to crush an American landing had failed, not because of superior weapons, but because small ships and their crews refused to back down. Commander Ernest Evans, lost with Johnston, was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive it. His ship and crew became a legend, proof that even against impossible odds, determination and sacrifice could alter the outcome of battle. In the decades since, the Battle off Samar has stood as a story larger than tactics and tonnage. It showed that the spirit of a fighting force can matter more than the balance of steel. Against all expectations, destroyers and destroyer escorts fought like battleships, and jeep carriers fought like fleet carriers. In their defiance, they wrote one of the most dramatic chapters of naval warfare ever recorded. And today, the legacy of that fight endures. It is remembered not as a tale of defeat, but as one of incredible courage, where a handful of ships took on an entire fleet and won. If you've stayed with us through this incredible history of courage and sacrifice, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves stories of determination against impossible odds. Your support helps us bring more untold history to life.